G'day. I'm going to talk about the things that you have to do to get the value from MIT and Kendall Square when you're not actually physically here. And I'm going to focus in particular on established enterprises, on businesses that have been around for a while and are mature and have a whole variety of resources. So I'm going to try and do this, and I was talking to a colleague about this, at 525,601 compression ratio. Because I've been working on this question about how do you get the most bang for your buck from investments in innovation technology for about 3 decades, and today I've got about 30 minutes. And that nets out at slightly over 500,000 to 1. But the offer, you will see that my email address, I'm pretty easy to find, is at the bottom, and I would love to continue this conversation with any of you. I think one of the reasons why I do so much work with ILP is because I really care about this stuff. I'm passionate about it. I'm happy to talk about it extemporaneously. I find myself talking to my girlfriend about it, to my daughters about it, to all of these people. And it's like, yeah, Michael. Let me put this in perspective. I actually began my career as an engineer. I was one of those people. Who here, first straw poll, who here has heard of the AI winter? Right? I'm one of those people who got out of AI because of the first AI winter at the end of the 80s. I spent the first decade of my career designing semiconductors, designing robotic systems, building complex AI-controlled factories. I spent a decade as an executive, part of what is now Vodafone in New Zealand, as the head of strategy, but also the head of R&D. So I ran a significant R&D organization. And then, about 20 years ago, having met and married an American, I moved from New Zealand to 5 Cambridge Centre, and I'm just going to orient myself, which is that building there next door, which at the time was an almost empty office space where we had managed to get very cheap office space. Where we managed to get very cheap office space. It's now Google's cafe. So if any of you, what was my corner office was Google's cafe. So if any of you were fortunate enough to spend time, oh no, they demolished that building. So it doesn't exist anymore. And that led me to being an expert, working initially primarily with tech companies, but then you just sort of get infected if you hang around here. And I found myself becoming an entrepreneur and sort of accidentally an educator, teaching at MIT and London Business School, and nowadays at MIT on the Integrated Design and Management program. And then this happened, which was about a decade ago, I've just realized. I got really interested in the impact that the technologies that I've been working on were having on the economy as a whole. And that became sort of a central theme of what I was doing, working with people like Vodafone and Thomson Reuters, not the technology producers, but the technology users. And my central theme is, one of my favorite things is a great science fiction quote. So this is William Gibson. The future is already here. And when I put the emphasis on highlight, I really do mean here. One of the things that is most interesting in terms of both the emerging technologies, but also the changing consumer behaviors really happen here. There are reasons to be here which are not just the technologies coming out of the labs, and not just the ecosystem, but also because when it comes, for instance, to digital cellular connectivity, the densest cellular connectivity in the whole of the United States is about a mile away in Central Square. You go, how come? Well, Cambridge skews heavily, highly educated, relatively affluent, and they're the people who are very big users of data connectivity. And for reasons which, if any of you are in FMCG or retail, I can explain, it turns out that most of the interesting retail experiments in the US happen over in Newbury Street and its environs on the other side of the river. So this is the most innovative square mile on the planet if you're actually dealing with anything that really involves technology. But in addition, and this is why when I keep asking, hey, you're from New Zealand, the weather's really nice, it has sane politics, and not much COVID. Would you ever move back? My answer is sadly no. Although I love the climate, it's a long way from anywhere else, and there aren't very many of us. And the thing that keeps me here is this is an unparalleled cluster of people who care about the theory of this stuff and do the research on it. So at the various business schools, but also in the engineering departments, people who are intensely focused on understanding what makes this productive. And I just picked a set of names, most of whom are good friends in one way or another. Clayton Christensen, who's unfortunately no longer with us. Rebecca Henderson, my mentor, who taught technology strategy a long time, has unfortunately defected to trying to save the planet at Harvard. Carlis Baldwin, who's done much of the path-breaking work on how you think about modularity. Michael Tushman, who's done the pioneering work on ambidexterity. They're going to talk about Marco Yanciti, Stefan Tomke, Stephen Eppinger, Fiona. And this is so unfair because given the limitations of the slide, to make this legible, I just picked a random top 10 out of this. And that means this is also a lot of thought about what goes on. And the reason this is so important is, and I've argued this before, that perhaps the most important technological innovation that the tech sector has ever provided is not a piece of hardware or software, but particularly in these troubling times, an approach to management and leadership. I don't know if there's anybody in the room here from either Samsung or Apple, both of whom I do a bunch of work with. You go, wow, they're big, they're powerful, but boy, it's hard running those businesses. Do you know why? You need to, in essence, completely reinvent your product line on about average every 2.5 years. And that requires a relentless, ruthless combination of things. Humility, this idea that you are going to have to keep reimagining yourself and reinventing it. These are organizations that absolutely do not believe in sustainable competitive advantage. You talk to them, they talk about running up the down escalator. And the reason for that is, hey, you're in semiconductors, the prices just keep dropping. You've got to find more and better reasons to do things. And they are never deluded into thinking the essence of strategy is long-term continuity. They have to be brave. They must make timely decisions, even where there's no consensus, based on incomplete or ambiguous information. But to do that, they use the evidence from experiments that come out of places like the labs here and so on. They use scenarios. They spend a lot of time thinking about how you buy a real option. And then nimble, even at scale. They change direction quickly. They outsource all the commodity activities. They make use of platforms. They create value through business ecosystems. And this is a very different way, or no, has been a very different way from running historical businesses, big, large, established enterprises. But a central part of my thesis is, given what's happened now, which makes this so important for so many of you, is that the environment in which we are all operating has changed dramatically. We now have this triple threat: digital, 5 technologies that together comprise a platform that is a general purpose technology. This is empowering consumers, it's enhancing connections, it's accelerating the pace of innovation, and in particular, it's energizing this wave of entrepreneurship. Not just here, although critically here almost more than anywhere else. Secondly, we have the enormous surge in the importance of ethical and environmental considerations. Unless you think this is about lip service or a possible compliance issue, some of the research that we're currently engaged in is seeing really radical shifts in consumer behavior and preferences. So this matters to you even in sectors as low tech as FMCG, where technology is becoming part of a way of dealing with issues such as, how do I actually verify the traceability of products that are coming out of a mine? And this combination of, and it's several facets to this. It is climate change, it's Me Too, it's Black Lives Matter, it's biodiversity, it's privacy, all of those issues. And if that wasn't difficult enough, we add the COVID shock. And yes, it's about behavioral stuff, but we've seen this surge in adoption and diffusion and innovation of digital technologies. We infected everybody on the planet, not just with, well, fortunately, we didn't infect everybody on the planet with the disease, but we did infect everybody on the planet with the digital disease. The relative importance of digital technology surged, and one of the most interesting observations is, what would we have done in the analog economy if COVID had come along? If there was no ability to do effective remote work? if there was no effective ability to do traceability, to use QR codes in restaurants and all these other things? A very interesting and unanswered economic question. And we've seen the dramatic acceleration of some trends and the reversal of others. It is going to fundamentally change the world of work. It is going to fundamentally change where people live. In fact, those trends are already underway. We happen to be doing some work at the moment on a 10 to 15 year time horizon for the demand for wireless cellular connectivity in the US, where we're going down at times to a 100-meter grid. And we are seeing dramatic changes. Who in the room is what we would call a digital immigrant? And this is a straw poll. And what I mean by that is someone who began their career before they had a PC and a broadband connection on their cell phone, but now have to deal with it. Everybody who here is between the ages of 30 and 49. Don't be shy. Okay. Significant proportion of the room. About 78% of that cohort, when asked, said COVID led to a dramatic shift in their behaviors. And we've seen this. What's happened is what we call the no going back cohort. You all started, on average, behaving like younger people. You started behaving like 20 to 30-year-olds. You have become your children. I'm sorry, and we've been looking really hard, and the evidence, the second-order differential says, it's getting worse. You are starting to behave more and more like your children in terms of use of digital technologies. So while that was going on, there are two things, these three factors. I think of it as a bit like the meteor and if you have only one takeaway from today, I give you this for free, how to pronounce that word. Everybody with me. Sheikh Shalub. Can I have everybody? Sheikh Shalub. I keep looking at it. I went out and found these things which tell you how to pronounce it. So it's Sheikh Shalub. The C-H-I-K, Sheikh Shalub. It exterminated 3/4 of all the plant and animal species on the Earth, including all the non-avian dinosaurs, whose enormous scale had made them the dominant terrestrial animals, and they'd been around for 140 million years. But what it also did was it opened up a whole variety of new ecological opportunities, and there was a massive surge in evolutionary innovation with radical diversification, new forms of species. That is what is going on in the economy as a whole, worldwide at the moment. So we're living in an environment where when you're thinking about what you're doing with the organization, you have to factor this into your calculations. Unfortunately, my second science fiction quote from a Scottish author called Ian M. Banks. This is for most business leaders necessarily an outside context problem. And the quote here is from a book called Accession. An outside context problem was the sort of thing most civilizations encountered just once, and which they tended to encounter rather in the way that a sentence such as this encounters a full stop. You don't have a bunch of stuff you can pick up and look at which will provide you with a helpful guide. So what do we know? We know that only those businesses that can harness digital technologies and accelerate human-centered breakthrough innovation and develop resilience so that we'll survive and thrive in this new abnormal. If you see anybody telling you when we get back to the new normal, they're wrong, it's not going to happen. You've got to adapt and build a set of capabilities, including how you interact with universities and innovation ecosystems that are appropriate to a very different decade coming up. And the key challenge that you face in doing that is this community with which you've got to interact is fundamentally different to what it's like to be in an established enterprise. You have ample, albeit finite, resources. I'm going to argue actually pretty strongly that resources are really just not a source of problem. The challenges, and Scott's research from Innovation Leader, I feel this should be a double act, that he's sort of talking about the survey data, I'm talking about the theory and what we know from practice, says they're very different because they are nimble, they are bold, and they are deeply collaborative. So what does this mean? Success depends more than anything else on what you do within your organization. It's the complement to the things that bring you here and the connections you make, how you decide what to do and how you organize and allocate your resources. And I'm going to introduce you to 3 key things. Absorptive capacity. Who here has heard that term before? 1, 2, 3. I'm delighted. Thank you. I got really interested. I did a search on this. And boy, am I going to give Harvard crap. Because I went and looked. This is a concept which is central to an understanding of how you harness innovation. I may be picking this point up slightly out of order. When I look at sort of the seminal article that discussed this, it has 47,000 citations in the academic literature. That's an almost unparalleled number. I went looking at how often Harvard Business Review has ever discussed the concept. There are 20 instances in the 30 years since this became the currency of innovation. And I started looking at that and saying, boy, I had not realized this before I put this together. So I ended up looking, when I was writing this, I had the advantage, for which I hope Randall Wright will forgive me, of starting my work on my specific, knowing what I wanted to talk about in general, but seeing the complete agenda before I actually wrote my piece, so trying to write it tightly to complement the other speakers. And there's a great deal of insight coming about how you engage with ecosystems, about where do cooperative innovation networks come from, about how you manage information flows, about technology scouting, focused here on either MIT or the Kendall Square ecosystem. And Marcus Darloff's going to talk about deep tech startups. And on the left, we have established enterprise, and here we have the cutting edge, and this is about the sort of the pure science, and up here is the end user. This is the key locus. It's what do you go do to complement those sorts of things if you want to get the most bang from your buck from interacting with this ecosystem. And my hybrid perspective says if we put together what we know from research and what works in practice, and this is reinforced by abundant anecdotal evidence, you actually need to start thinking about a variety of slightly different ways of doing things. First, you must invest in absorptive capacity so that you can internalize the technologies or the other lessons that you identify. What do we mean by absorptive capacity? The definition is here from the seminal article. The ability of a firm to recognize the value of new external information, to assimilate it, and to apply it to commercial ends. If you will not make those investments in-house, it's not worth your time, energy, or effort coming here. It's just innovation tourism. So what does that mean? You actually have to develop the capabilities internally. There is no substitute for having people in your organization who have hands-on experience with working this. So experienced people, equipment, laboratory space, and embracing experimentation, actually really building stuff, maybe at small scale, maybe only at the prototype stage, but not just reading the literature, not just having the conversations, not just paying the visit. You've got to do shit. The academic literature offers decades of empirical evidence for the value of absorptive capacity. As somebody who teaches, it's important to sort of go and say, oh, let me go check what I think this is. There was an article which, until I did this, I hadn't read, which is a meta-analysis, which is code for, we've tried to read and review everything that's ever been written, this of 30 years of empirical evidence. For large, well-established firms, the larger and older the firm, the lower, in all things being equal, is its absorptive capacity. Why? You've got really good at doing whatever you're doing, but probably nowhere near as good at finding out effective mechanisms to bring stuff in from outside. And firms must invest, this is Rebecca Henderson and Ian Coburn's seminal article, in complementary in-house R&D, and to provide strong incentives for internal groups to collaborate actively with research institutions if they're going to make effective. If you don't do those two things, if you don't build units of the right sort of size and incent and motivate the people to go do it, you will not be able to extract and capture the value that is present at MIT. One caveat to that, don't just do it randomly. You need to have a strategy. 2 key criteria. Does it really matter to customers? And should we be the ones investing in doing it? And the reason for highlighting that is way too much money gets wasted in R&D on things that aren't actually going to move the needle as far as it comes to customers, or being spent in-house when you would be far better off partnering or collaborating to go do with it because there are people who are better equipped. So only if it's a bottleneck, where you're providing some valuable, inimitable, non-substitutable solution, and you can maintain control over it, should you be making those investments. Although that will require a bunch of experiments, perhaps, to do it. So that's the first big thing. You're going to have to make that investment in what we would call absorptive capacity. Secondly, you need to organize for ambidexterity. Now, this has broader currency, so that your innovative efforts aren't forced to compete for resources with the activities that are already generating revenue. You know why? Because typically they will lose. In particular, if they don't have top management support, that's where the big battalions are. That's where the people are. That's where the political power in the organization lies. What we're talking about here is the ability to simultaneously pursue both incremental and discontinuous innovation, doing it by hosting multiple contradictory structures, processes, and cultures within the same firm. And although there are a variety of discussions about ways to go do it, the overwhelming evidence says that you need to have explorative business units that are separate from the core, the exploitative unit, so that they have the autonomy to experiment. They have milestone-based funding, which is brutal in terms of what it goes, and direct reporting to the top of the organization, so that you're actually in a position to make sure that the difficult trade-offs that this involves are overseen by people who have the authority to go do it. Now, I commend to all of you, where is Scott? So Scott Kirshner's Innovation Leader Organization, in particular, as part of my prep for this, I sat down and read in some depth the InnoLead article to which he links on the website for this conference, the paper. And what's the evidence from that survey data? These are selected quotes. What do you need? A dedicated team that can act quickly, limited red tape, a dedicated liaison inside and outside. This middle one I think of as impedance matching. If you try and take a small startup and you have them directly interact with the core of a large, long-established company with thousands or tens of thousands of people, they just talk past each other for long periods of time and get nowhere. An internal engagement team. And this applies even amongst you, those of you who self-identified as very experienced. Nearly 1/3 of the very experienced respondents agreed they're in need of a better process for integration, or, my emphasis, a better organizational structure. And this has actually been reflected in the successes we see. She's online as one of the participants because she works on the West Coast, and I must at this point acknowledge the enormous contribution that my colleague Nitzan Schwertner, who is an MIT graduate and an analog devices alumna, established. That you need, there's a whole variety of examples of this being done very successfully. I'm just selecting from a myriad of examples, ones with which I'm personally familiar. The Analog Garage, historically a semiconductor company, as its products became commoditized, they looked for new ways to create value, and they created a startup with stability. Now, it's interesting, it's got so big, it's scaled so far that it's moved a little further back out, but it still maintains a presence here. Shell TechWorks, innovation center based in Boston, Massachusetts. Actually, it was on this side of the river. So it wasn't in Boston, it was in Cambridge. It was at 1 Broadway, which is the building just across the street originally, and then it was at 101, and then it moved out, and this sort of scale up of creating a new enterprise and watching it scale. BAE Systems with the Fast Labs, there are a set of quotations from the guys at BAE in the report, J&J Innovation. And these are all very large, multi-billion-dollar, long-established companies with histories where their core doesn't necessarily move that fast. And I'm now about to be very rude. The other thing you have to do is to figure out how you hamstring, as part of this, what I have come to call the 4 horsemen of the AI apocalypse. IT. Your computer is not one of our approved models. Well, I need the processing power. Why do you need the processing power? Going back 20 years to writing a business case for a specific computer. That cloud service is not on our approved vendor list. Oh, so you would prefer that I build it from scratch? Yes? Ah, great, thank you. I think I'll go get a job somewhere else. HR, this candidate does not have the required academic qualifications. They've done 3 startups. Okay, yeah, but they didn't graduate from college. Budgeting, you must prove the certain ROI from this project before we will authorize you to do the experiments that determine whether or not it will work. Compliance. These terms and conditions don't comply with our risk guidelines because we may find ourselves in a position that if we expand this to a global footprint, one of our subsidiaries in other parts of the world may not be in compliance. Well, just shoot me now. Finally, you must actually also develop acuity. Now, even for the native English speakers, this is not necessarily a word with which you may be familiar. This is clarity of thought and vision. Looking outside the organization for insight about what is happening and for foresight about what will happen next. In turbulent times such as these, you've got to actually shift your focus to the outside world, get outside the building, come here, get outside the town, get outside the country, invest money and in particular top management time into understanding trends, incentives and dynamics. So you build a capability for pattern recognition about the way in the world is happening so that you have a well-defined strategy. And leading companies have been differentiated by doing that. One of the people I've done a lot of work with is Crown Castle, of whom I'm sure almost none of you have ever heard. But they own half the cell towers in the US and a significantly larger chunk of the fiber infrastructure in metro areas. They've made big multi-billion dollar investments or tens of billions of dollars investments on a 10-year plus time horizon informed by long-run projections that are based on models from first principles. Putting this together made me feel really old. We are coming up to the 10th anniversary of work with Thomson Reuters on the importance of AI. We started working with them in early 2012. Swiss Re, they're reinsurers. Boy, did they, although they renew their premiums every year, so you would think they could move quickly, they've been leading the long-term battle against climate change because they're the guys who write the checks. They have a very powerful economic incentive, but also from an ethical point of view, that the Swiss Re Institute has put a huge amount of effort into understanding the implications this has. And I love these guys. For those of you who don't know, they're one of the people leading the death of coal because they did this. They said to the people they were insuring, we won't reinsure coal. Insurers went, oh, that's a bit of a bugger. I'll go get my reinsurance from somewhere else. They said, you're welcome, thank you. No, you don't fully understand, though. We won't reinsure you if you insure coal anywhere. Why? Well, if you're stupid enough to be insuring coal, we don't think your ability to assess risk is good enough. So you can't have any reassurance. So I don't know if we've got anybody here online from Australia, but it has put Australia, which is still, for reasons which are only comprehensible if you understand Australian politics, continuing to try and invest in coal in the situation where they are seriously thinking about a $200 billion mutualization of the risk associated with coal infrastructure, because there's no insurer left on the planet who will provide them with any insurance company cover for new coal facilities. Oh, what we're going to do is we're going to make Australian consumers pay $200 billion to make investments which will kill the planet. Yeah, Australian politics are weird. And one of my favorite examples, Schneider Electric. I'm going to admit, as a New Zealander, we have a certain prejudice against the French, so apologies to anybody in France here. We went to war with you at one point over Rainbow Warrior. But when we started looking at businesses that were doing an incredibly good job about innovating with digital technology, Schneider Electric came out way ahead of almost anyone else. And one of the things from talking to them that was distinctive about this was a huge and significant shift in the time of their top management team. where they all guaranteed to spend between 2 and 4 days in every month, between half a day and a day a week, which is a huge chunk of the top management's team's time, developing acuity and looking outside the organization. And as part of that, I emphasize that this trigger was to a large extent catalyzed by some MIT sessions with George Westerman a little while ago. And as part of this, 2 of their top management team actually have offices down on Main Street, right below where ILP is. So if you're there and you want to pop around the corner, there's a small Schneider Electric footprint here. And when you look at, again, the evidence from the innovation leader stuff, targeted searches, decrease the phishing evidence, have a very clear business case for what you're doing. And I thought for a long while that was enough, but as I've been working over this, and we got 2 or 3 years into doing this sort of stuff, I discovered that sometimes it was not coming to fruition. So here's the last thing you need. You actually need to have courage. You need to have audacity. Going beyond lip sync and lip service to actually making the real investments, to accepting the risk. Breakthrough innovation involves risk. You set ambitious long-term objectives, focus on the opportunity, accept the risk and uncertainty. And if you go all the way back to what I was talking about one of the perhaps the most important things coming out of the technology sector is this, as I started looking at what was characteristic of the organizations who as users were thriving in these difficult climates, they were starting to behave like tech companies. Their managerial practices were evolving in that direction, because of the relative importance of the technologies and the need for renewal and everything that tech companies have learned about operating in a hostile, unforgiving, and highly uncertain environment. And from the Innovation Leader Survey again, being willing to pilot just to try something new, having a faster approval process. Financials would executives, this is a calculated risk, but it has tremendous possibilities. So to summarize, why should you care? This is a matter of corporate life and death. It's not enough to just visit to have the conversations or to connect. The primary vector is what you do within the organization. You must do these things if you want to really get the bang for the buck. Make the investments, create the separate organizational structures, build a sense about the way in which the world is changing, have the courage to make investments, put something on the ground here. I'm going to let Tim Rowe, who's going to speak at the end of the afternoon, talk about the reality of watching that happen hundreds of times. And what does that mean? Strategize, organize, invest, and move. It also means you should probably kill a variety of stuff. And this is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say. You should disinvest in incremental innovation. Unless the payoff is massive, the time horizon is short, and the opportunity cost is negligible. It's the only way you're going to free management time and other scarce resources. Cut all your dispersed bottom-up innovation programs. They're not going to move the needle. Stop imitating your peers, stop benchmarking your peers, and stop developing best practices. You've got to go do something different. Thank you. So. Cool.
We'll take the high vote question here. You talked about the importance of breakthrough innovation. How do you see the balance of investment in incremental, I think you may have answered this, innovation versus radical or breakthrough innovation?
It's interesting you asked that. You and I have been talking in the context of a bunch of ILP sessions. So Randall has the advantage of seeing my perspective shift, beginning in about 2018 and 2019 pre-COVID, and now moving towards, I'm a radical about being radical, right? If you're operating in a complex environment in which you face new competitors who can move quickly and erode your economies of scope, and some of your peers are starting to move quickly, you need to stop pouring effort into incremental innovation, because it ain't going to move the needle far enough in most cases. So the relative balance of this says that there are times when you need to make a really big shift towards radical or breakthrough innovation. And this is one of those times. This next decade is a period of very significant change in enabling technologies, in consumer behaviors, in other considerations around ethics and environmental issues. So getting there a little bit at a time ain't going to move the needle.
I think we have another question. Does remote work or the Great Resignation change the importance of actually physically being here?
I don't think so. And so this is I'm looking forward to having a discussion with Scott about this in particular, because we may have slightly different perspectives on this. The first is, if you're in anything that involves anything vaguely tangible, it's actually really important, right? There's a reason we have a big robotics cluster, a huge, in fact, probably the world's largest robotics cluster, and that actually means that you have to be here. If you're going to do something in healthcare, you're going to have to interact with patients, right? Real patients in real worlds. I mean, I'm CEO of a startup in that space, and we found ourselves forced to slow down for a couple of years during COVID. Same things, anything to do with hardware, material science, software, chemicals, right? Physical presence matters. And even if you're not there all the time, the ability to come together when you need it. We still have a physical office space. We had a big debate about it. We have it for two reasons. One is so we can come together in a private space when we want to. And secondly, it turns out that actually some of our younger employees really want to come into the office some days of the week to get away from their roommates, right? And actually to be in a social setting rather than in a suburb where they've chosen to live. So we have physical space across the street at 245 Main. No, not across the street, next door at 245 Main. Cool.
And what is preventing the mindset change needed to develop absorptive, ambidextrous, and acuity mindset?
This stuff's new. It's new to most managers. This is back to the mild version of the outside context problem. These aren't, if you were working in a large, diversified conglomerate and you came in on the fast track and you came in consumer marketing, and what you did was first you worked in a variety of different functions, and then you worked in a variety of different geographies, and then you worked on a variety of different business lines, you could have complete mastery historically of the things that were important to the organization, because you could be an expert on the organization, and you didn't really have to worry about the outside world or severe disruption, because the beast was doing extraordinarily well. This is scary. I go back to what I was saying about, for tech organizations, it's business as usual, but for most established enterprises, the idea that you need to think about making bets, taking risks, making investments, juggling a nasty compromise between continuity, having to make trade-offs amongst the relative importance of budgeting systems, dealing with those fights, and shift a whole bunch of your time to being outside in the world rather than the rest, which, let me be clear, is not easy because it involves real risk. If you're a member of a top management team and you shift your time so that you're spending half a day a week or a day a week doing something else, you're neglecting something. You're not talking to a direct report who's going to screw something up, or you're not talking to an investor or a customer or someone, and that time is not for free, right? So, but it's the right trade-off to make. So cool.
Michael, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.